We're going to go with James in Canada. The topic is utility of using philosophy as a proof of God. Can the syllogism be convincing? Hey, James, how are you doing?
Hey.
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Oh, I'm doing good. I can hear the accent. A fellow Canadian.
the Canadian rise,
I didn't know
right?
you were Canadian. Well, that's great. First of all, big fan. Love you guys. So I've been having a few thoughts while watching some of these shows, and I'm trying to understand how people can treat a philosophical argument as proof for something like a God. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by the visuals. I'm going to turn off the browser. Okay, so maybe a hypothetical would be the best way to go. Someone presents you with a perfect syllogism that does not require, that does not use any empirically verifiable information.
Mm-hmm.
And the syllogism's conclusion is, therefore, the God of Catholics or Protestants, any God, is true.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with that? Do you suddenly become a theist?
I typically end up denying.
Or should you become a theist?
Well, so there's actually a lot here. One of those. So what you're saying, you're asking about a syllogism that's going to be devoid of empirical knowledge. And in philosophy, sometimes you'll hear the term a posteriori. It's just kind of a fancy word for empirical, and then that's kind of juxtaposed to something called a priori. And that's going to be something that doesn't really require, empirical experience of the world. And so what you're asking is one of those types of arguments, which is an a priori deductive argument. I don't find them convincing to establish like what we would call ontology in philosophy, or like what something is. It seems pretty skeptical to me. Like if you had some valid argument in terms of its structure is valid, seemingly the content of it is where I'm always going to jump off, because I'm not really certain how, like let's take the modal ontological argument, right, or something like that, or some argument that invokes like some term like greatness, right, or a perfect being or something, or whatever it might be. Well, I have issues with those notions because there's like a semantic battle there, because what someone means by greatness versus what I mean by greatness, or what someone means by perfection versus what I mean by perfection, may just not work. And if one of their arguments is getting to this perfect God, or they have this perfection component in the argument, just as an example, well, I take perfection much differently. My notion of perfection is a being that has no goals, right? All goals have been successfully completed. It doesn't need to take a step to the left, doesn't need to take a step to the right, doesn't need to create. It's not compelled to do anything. If it had at some time interval needed to make a step to the left or create, well, what was it in that time period? It didn't achieve all goals, so thus it wasn't perfect. And so my notion of perfect that I'm going to argue against is that it's just a being that merely does nothing, right? It just merely exists in a perfect state. It would do no action. Otherwise, it would have to be compelled to do that thing. And so my point being on this is that people will use terms in the premises of the argument that we're just going to talk past each other on. And so my biggest issue with any of these a priori arguments is I'm having to like dissect the terms and what they mean. And then in a lot of cases, it's like pointing out something in the world, or it's pointing out some notion that they've just kind of made up. And so I don't really know what the success of the conclusion is going to be if we're just using these kind of notions that can be interpreted in a multitude of ways. I mean, your notion of greatness is what's called normative. It's just some standard that you have, but I could take a different notion. And I don't know how the modal ontological or some other argument that invokes some term like that gets off the ground if we don't have a rigorous definition of the terms. So that's one issue I have, but probably the least of the issues, but one of the issues I have.
Yeah, that's more or less what I was leaning at, is where my personal feelings were, is that without empirical evidence, I don't see how someone can come up with a, quote, perfect philosophical argument, unquote. Anyway, okay, good. I mean, basically, that's where I was at. I'm trying to wonder, because all of these apologists are just relying on whatever it is that they're talking about. I'm not going to use the words that's coming to my mind.
So
anyway, okay, great,
James,
man. Thanks. You answered my question. That was perfect.
Well, James, no, there's one other thing about this, and then I want to see if Erin wants to chime in on this before you go. There's a point that someone that I look up to in terms of these types of conversations mentions that I think is a pretty good point, and that's about it kind of goes tandem with what I'm saying. There's a kind of a shared background. There needs to be a shared background information between the two people that are engaging in an argument. So like if you present an deductive argument that God exists and I'm presenting some deductive argument that God doesn't exist, I don't find that it's going to be successful in some cases where you just like are just trying to present some argument that assumes things that I already don't accept, like maybe some metaphysics, like say I'm a physicalist and their argument is going to have components of like physicalism not being true. Well, we're already on a non-starter, right? Like I'm on the bus, I pull the cord, I get off the bus stop, right? I just deny the premise. And so in a lot of cases, when you present these arguments, it's going to assume something that the other person just doesn't accept. So what I find to be better for arguments is to actually take like things that the other person believes and derive a contradiction out of it, right? Like a God that is infallible, that can't fail, but also desires a world without evil. And then we go, hey, well, the Christian goes, hey, well, there's evil in the world. Well, we have a failure, right? We have something that didn't want X, but then X actualized, and then, oh, it can't fail, right? That's going to be successful because it's taking things that the other person accepts and showing tension between those things that they accept. Doesn't matter if I die tomorrow or if I never existed. That's a problem they have to wrestle with. So I think arguments in that case are successful, but not from like one where you're assuming something that the other person just denies.
Yeah, I agreed. Yeah. I'm not arguing with you. I agree with you completely. Every time I watch one of these discussions, I'm just seeing that they're talking. One person is trying to have a conversation, the other is just making assertions out of the blue. And even if you listen to two different apologists, they're actually differing in some fundamental way. Anyway, that's good, Ed. You cleared that up. I mean, I'm just trying to understand how some people's minds work, and obviously, I'm not going to figure that out anytime soon.
And James, there's an easier one too. If it's a Christian giving you this like a priori deductive argument, what they're telling you is that this a priori human constructed argument is better than like the salvation of Jesus through the text or through some experience or revelation or through faith, right? They're basically conceding to you that those things are not good to believe in something. And so they're going to have to default to something that they don't realize they're putting Jesus below that argument, right? Because if Jesus really is like truth, then I'm going to come to that. I don't know how a deductive argument is going to be more successful than that revelation.
Yeah, no, I didn't track you there. You might have to elaborate a bit. I didn't catch the contradiction that you're.
No, it's not that it's a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. It's saying that if I talk to like a Christian, and I have a lot of Christian friends, and they present some deductive argument for God, well, one, they're giving me this like vanilla kind of version of God, right? Two, they haven't told me anything about the incarnation. They haven't told me anything about the Trinity, right? So it's not even fair for me to say that this is a reasonable case for an argument when there's all this other stuff on the back end, angels, demons, all this other stuff that's part of their worldview that I've heard nothing about yet, right? So it's going to be one issue there. Two, because those things do exist and there's like Jesus at the back end here, right? Or like the main thing, they're basically putting an argument, a deductive argument. If they're a Christian, they're going to think that that's going to convince me better for some reason than like scripture or like an actual revelation from Jesus. And that to me is like, you're saying philosophy is going to do a better job here than what Jesus actually has to offer. That's what it sounds like to me. It sounds like they're taking stock in some man-made deductive argument over what actually got them to believe that Christ was God or whatever.
That's what I call the Jesus is love argument.
Yeah, that's about my like kind of my perspective on it too, Jmike and James. Like I don't think I ever heard a proper syllogistic argument my whole time as a Christian, to be completely honest. Like that's something that's never talked about on Sunday mornings. It's something that I think most people will discover once they're already kind of like maybe like struggling with holding on to their beliefs, and then they go to look for this evidential proof of God, and it's not there. So I'm not discounting philosophy as a whole practice. Like I think there's definitely there's good use for it because it helps people bounce off their ideas and refine their thoughts on things. But as far as proof for God, it's I just don't see it as something that is used as an evangelistic tool, like in the church, because I don't think it's actually that convincing. And I didn't know much about philosophy when I was a Christian. I've learned more about it since deconverting. I'm still learning about it. And I even in my early days of like looking at debates, I had a hard time understanding a little bit why these things were like not making sense, because everything they're saying kind of does make sense, but then understanding like they are coming from these two completely different like that background knowledge that Mike was talking about. So understanding more about the actual differences, like how they're seeing the things, has made it make a lot more sense to me of why people just can't come to an agreement on things, because they are looking at it from completely different background information. And this whole idea of just like using words completely differently, or having like these completely useless words, I would say sometimes, like these words you wouldn't normally use in everyday language. That's something that's like
the idea that you could sit in a chair and determine like the fundamental nature of reality by pure deduction in your mind seems like you're taking a lot of stock in your own ignorance, and then the type of inferences that you can string together with those types of that type of content. It's really it's strange to me in that sense, because like you'd think Jesus would have just given the deductive argument on the Sermon on the Mount or something, right? Or Muhammad would have just given
If that was convincing, that might be in one of the Gospels.
I love listening to those armchair. Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just agreeing with that with Jmike, that if that was the only thing that was needed to convince people of God, then why wasn't it just like in one of the Gospels? Like, if that's convincing, kind of thing.
Because you always need Tom, or which one's the cat chasing the mouse? Tom, Kit. You always need that Jerry. Dynamic, right? You always need this element of like, well, then nobody would actually have the choice, right? And so you have to play this chasing game of like, well, yeah, but if it was just obviously true, then like, what would be the fun in that? It's like, I never, but if it's obviously true, then it shouldn't be able to hide and escape from like actual rigorous investigation, which seemingly it does. But
well, yes, that is exactly what I think also. I mean, if it's that obvious, it should be incredibly obvious to just anybody, and you don't have to go through these mental gymnastics to try and make a point. Yeah, it's a world that I just simply can't understand. Maybe I'm just too old to understand modern people or these types of people, because they're not actually modern, are they?
Well, so like there's there's utility, right, and obviously in propositional logic and stuff, but what's not usually being done in those applications is like deducting supernatural beings for which we have no implicit data for, right? So I think I wouldn't make this as hard, like, or if this is a struggle or something that bothers you. I mean, you can just hold the view that, hey, so I think Sean Carroll is somebody that also holds the view, like, I don't think that a priori arguments for God could ever be successful, right? It's not any theist or Christian that's going to like scoff at that. I'm just like, okay, well, I still don't see that you've demonstrated your case, so I don't know what you're laughing about, but yeah.
Yep. No,
well, we're gonna
want to give
sorry, James.
That this is caused. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I interrupted you. Go ahead, James.
It's the leg between Canada, and, like wherever you're calling from, Canada to Austin. There's just there's a leg.
I know that. And there may be an extra lag because I decided to use Skype for some silly reason, and that may be adding to the problem. Yeah, I'm calling from Ottawa, actually, the great capital.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, man. I really appreciate your time. And thank you for clarifying this point for me. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, James.
All right. Have a nice one.
You too.
Bye.